Tritone substitution is a stupidly simple and useful idea, but the music theory behind it hits hard. And we're about to dive deep into the bowels of music theory, and I'm going to show you where the tritone substitution comes from and just how you can use it. But first, let's just hear what it sounds like. Let's start in the key of C, and I'm going to play you two examples. Listen to how similar they sound to each other. And this one? Did you get it? Here, let me do it again. The first progression you heard was just G7 to C major. It's just a normal perfect cadence, 5-1. The second progression was a D flat 7 to C. D flat is not diatonic to our key of C major, but it sounds really similar, if not like identical, to the G7 chord. Both of these chords, G7 and D flat 7, have a dominant function, and that just means they want to take us back home to the one chord C major. But we come from different places, right? The G is a fifth above C, and the D flat is just a half step above. Here, listen to it again and pay close attention to the bottom note. That bass note movement is the key. Notice that in our second example, D flat 7 to C, the bass note only moves chromatically, just down a half step. Because these two chords are so similar, and because they have the same musical function, we often substitute them for each other. This is what we call a tritone substitution, and it's so common. I mean, we hear it all over the music we listen to. Check out what happens if I play Amazing Grace, but I'll substitute that last 5-1 cadence for our tritone substitute. Okay, so let's start with Amazing Grace. I'll play it without the substitution first. Now here it is with the tritone sub. We hear these tritone subs all the time in jazz. Like in this, it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. Or here in Satin Doll. We actually hear this sound in classical music too, as far back as the Renaissance period. For example, here it is prominently in Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Rossini used it in his William Tell Overture. Classical purists would call this an augmented sixth chord, not a tritone sub, and that's because it technically has a subdominant function, not a dominant function. It's some kind of like a German sixth or maybe Italian sixth. I don't know. I always get them confused. It's some kind of Western European augmented sixth chord. Who cares? Like, we're jazz players. I don't have patience for all this 1600s figured bass bullshit. We hear these tritone subs all over pop music and soundtracks too. Like here it is from the Pink Panther theme. And another example, Fiona Apple used it in her song Criminal. But even though they have a funny sounding name, tritone substitutions are an absolutely fundamental music concept that you have got to know if you want to impress your friends. So let me break down how it works for you step by step. Okay, let's take a closer look at what these chords have in common. So if we start with our G7 chord, our G7 chord has 4 notes, G, B, D, and F. And our D flat 7 chord has a D flat, an F, an A flat, and a C flat. Now, look at these two chords and see what notes are in common between them. The first one is really easy to see. It's just the F. Both chords have an F in it. But if we look closer, you'll see that we have a B in one and a C flat in the other. And those two notes are actually the same. They sound the same. Music theory people are just weird sometimes in how we spell those. But they're just two different names for the same sound. When we spell out our G7 chord, B is the third and F is the seventh. But in D flat 7, we flip-flop those. The B that used to be the third is now the seventh, and the F is now the third. This brings up something really fascinating, and maybe I'm just a music theory nerd that gets excited by stupid things, but it points out to us that our octave is symmetrical. See, check this out. If we start on an F octave and we work our way inwards chromatically, our hands line up on B. That note B is exactly the halfway point in our octave. The same thing happens if we start on B. Start on a B octave, we'll move back in chromatically, our hands line up on F. So the B is the halfway point in an F octave, and the F is the halfway point in the B octave. Do you see the symmetry? Let me see if I can describe this a little bit simpler. Our octave has 12 notes in it, right? It's 12 half steps to go from one B up to the next B. Or you could think about it this way. We have 6 whole steps to go from B to B. Well, the halfway point would be just 3 whole steps, and that's an interval that we call the tritone. 3 whole steps is exactly half an octave, and we call that the tritone. Let's try to put this all back together. If we take a dominant 7th chord and we spell it out, the 3rd and the 7th notes of the chord are apart by a tritone interval. And we know that tritone is symmetrical. So what happens if we take the 3 and the 7, the tritone, and we reflect it so that we find a new chord where the old 3 is the new 7 and the old 7 is the new 3. Basically, if we take our B and F, which are the 3rd and 7th, we flip-flop them so that the F is the 3rd and the B becomes the 7th. We have a new dominant 7th chord. So what chord has an F as the 3rd and the B as the 7th? Well, if we relabel that B as C flat again, we get our D flat 7 chord again that we talked about earlier. So let's look at it in context. Our 7th chords have a dominant function, which just means they're going to resolve down a 5th. Our G7 chord, for example, is going to resolve down to C. If we swap the G in our bass for a D flat, we get this really nice voice leading in the bass, D flat to C. Let's take that 5-1 and take it a step further by making it a 2-5-1. Here's a regular 2-5-1. And now check out what happens when we put our substitution in place, taking the G out and putting the D flat in. We get that really smooth voice leading, D to D flat to C. We can take this even further. What if we applied it to a turnaround, like a 3-6-2-5-1 progression? If we use a tritone sub on the 6 and on the 5, we get this. The bass line is all chromatic, E to E flat to D flat to C. I hope you're starting to see the potential. Let's say we're playing a blues in the key of G, and we're moving away from the 1 chord to the 4 chord. By making our 1 chord a 7th chord, we have a G7 that resolves down a 5th to C. And as we just saw a minute ago, we can substitute that G7 for D flat and give us some nice movement into the 4 chord. Dave Grusin wrote this great slow blues tune called Ray's Blues. He wrote it for the soundtrack for the movie called The Firm, and almost every chord in that song has a tritone substitution in front of it. Okay. We've just learned that anytime we see a 5 chord, we can substitute a dominant 7th chord a tritone away. So our G7 chord can be substituted for D flat 7, and we can take that idea and transpose it across all the keys. So does this really work like all of the time? And I'm here to say, yeah, it really does, except for one important consideration, the melody. See, check out what happens if I use a tritone substitution on Happy Birthday. Yeah, see that? It just doesn't really work. The tritone interval is pretty dissonant. And while we really like dissonance when we're playing dominant chords, we have to be super careful if the melody is creating the dissonance. Since we moved our chord by a tritone, but we didn't move the melody, what What happens is our melody note can be a tritone away from another chord tone, or even worse, like it is here in Happy Birthday, it can be a minor ninth, and that dissonance can be pretty intense. So you and I, we've got to be a bit strategic when we use these tritone substitutions. We either have to make sure that the melody note is going to work, or we have to adjust the melody, actually shift it around to make it fit the new chord. If you're a comping musician like a pianist like me, or maybe a guitarist, I want to show you something really useful and honestly, a little bit scary. When we comp in an ensemble, we typically leave out the root. We're going to let our bass player play it instead. So for example, if we're playing a G7 chord, we might just play a G7 shell and we're going to let our bass player cover the root G. But as we just learned, the G7 shell and the D flat 7 shell are the same, which means the root note, which tells the difference, is not our call to make. It's completely up to the bass player. He can just decide to play D flat instead of G7 if he wants to. He or she gets to make the game time decision as to what sound they want to create. So we have really got to be on our game. It is so important that we recognize that substitution when it happens, because we might have to change what we're playing to match. If we're soloing over G7, for example, and the bass player decides to switch it to D flat 7, well, we better be ready to alter our melody or to change our soloing to play over D flat 7 instead. The bass player doesn't get to have all the fun, though. We have some tricks up our sleeve, too. And here's a hack that my teacher Barry Harris taught me. If you keep the root on the 5, G, but we comp using a flat 2 chord, or D flat, it turns our vanilla G7 chord into G7 altered. All we had to do was think D flat and let our bass player keep playing G7. So we could let the bass player keep playing G, we switch to D flat, and we get all these cool alterations for free. Pretty neat. I find this idea so fascinating and interesting because something as vanilla as just the 5-1 cadence, which most of us learned on day 1 of jazz school, because of this tritone thing and all these extensions and variations, there are so many more options and scales we can play and movements that we can put on top of this, but that's just too much for this video. We're going to have to save that for another day. Speaking of another day, I would love to have you back for future videos, and the easiest way to do that is just hit the subscribe button and YouTube will reconnect us. And while you're waiting, check out this video on spicy dominant chords that every jazz pianist needs to know.